Hi everyone, I'm Luke Hector and you're watching The Broken Meeple. This is a YouTube channel about board games where I give reviews, top 10s and my honest opinions, regardless of the consequences.
Get on with it.
I got a little special one for you, Evacuation. This is not a review copy. I grabbed this at Essen and was not entirely sure if I would ever get a chance to review it. Another heavy game on top of everything else I was doing, but recently it's been getting the beans, both solo and multiplayer, and I figured it was about time I gave my thoughts on it. So my history with Vladimir Suhi is hit and miss. I mean, I've got games from him that I adore. Underwater Cities and Pulsar 2849 are still 10 out of 10s in my book. I love those two games. They are the pinnacle of his designs. But then on the flip side, I wasn't a big fan of Woodcraft. I think that was his design. Didn't really go much for Messina that much. That was okay, you know, good, above average at best. And Praga, okay, you know, Praga's fine, it's good, but nothing to write home about. And I didn't particularly gravitate to Shipyard in the old days, so I don't really care about the new version. And I've heard enough problems about that one production-wise anyway. But, so he's very hit and miss. Now, the theme of this one sounded interesting. The idea of, you know, an old world dying, you got to evacuate all the stuff from there to another planet and mitigate the resources between the two places. That sounded pretty cool. But of course, you know, I went in with tempered expectations, thinking, okay, it's another combination of delicious games and Vladimir. Let's see if this one can elevate up to the same levels as Underwater Cities, or is it just going to be a forgettable one like the others, or is it going to be something much worse? Let's see. So Evacuation can be played in two different modes. They play out pretty much the same. It's more how the end game works. You know, there's a bit of a difference in scoring in that. But let's stick with like race mode for the moment. In this, you basically have to evacuate all the people and factories that you have off this old planet and stick them on the new planet. You have 4 rounds to do this, and essentially in the race mode, you carry on until somebody has met a specific criteria of certain production values and stadiums, and then they will trigger the end of the game. In the points game, you just play the full 4 rounds, and you have different ways of scoring, as well as some goal cards that you can, like, you know, objectives that you can aim for that score more points. That's predominantly the difference between the two. But the way it works is on your board you have technology tiles which you shuffle at the start of the game, and they can be in different combinations. You also have 2 aspects, the old world and the new world, and I quite like the fact that it can be tailored to either side depending on where you're sitting on the table. That's pretty cool. But the idea is that in order to do actions during the round, you have to spend energy, which is going to get more costly the more actions you do. You have 4 slots at the bottom where you essentially place an action card below, it's just a marker, to do one of those actions. You can also play a variant to use these as proper action cards. We'll get onto those a bit later. But these actions revolve around gaining more technologies, gaining resources, building factories, getting more ships which you use to transport stuff from old to new, and so on and so forth. But there's another aspect to this. There is also a power level associated with these actions. So once you've had the action phase and you've done everything you want to do and you've passed, you total up all the values of those actions you've done and work out your power level, let's say 8 for example. And then what happens is that you have this progress chart that slingshots around all the planets, and as you total up your power level, you get to move these little markers across this track which allow you to settle on different areas of the new planet or get occasional little bonuses. On top of that, you've also got bonus cards at the end of each round where if your power level is at a certain level, you'll get another bonus on top. But predominantly it all revolves around shipping from one end to the other and mitigating your resources between them both, because when you produce when you produce on one planet, it will produce on that planet. So I can't spend old world resources to do stuff on the new planet and vice versa, with 1 or 2 minor exceptions. We'll get onto that a bit later. But the idea is that if you gain something, it can go on either planet, and so you've got to decide, well, okay, I kind of need it on the new one or I need it on the old one. And how do you get it from the old to the new? Well, you build ships. These ships have different carrying capacities for resources and the different like bays that you have, which are represented by little tiles. And so as you evacuate stuff off the old world, you'll then produce less on the old world, but if you can ship it to the new world and get it settled quickly, you'll start producing stuff on the new world. So it is very much a sort of tug-of-war balancing exercise of the scales to make certain that you're not too crippled on one side, maybe too lucrative on the other, and so on and so forth. Over 4 rounds, you have to meet certain food requirements and stadium requirements to keep everybody happy, and by the end of the game, you must have a certain amount of entertainment for the new people, because, I mean, well, you gotta live, but you've also gotta be entertained, and the board games aren't gonna cut it entirely. And so at the end of the 4 rounds, you either total up the points and see who's won in that variant, or in the race variant, somebody will eventually hit the criteria of 3 production markers at 8 or more and 3 stadiums and trigger the end, and then you work out the winner in that respect. I'll give it props. This game does feel pretty unique to a lot of games out there. This whole concept of shipping from one bit to the new bit and having to balance your resources on both. The closest thing I can think of, and it's a much heavier game than this one, so heavy it didn't even stay on my shelf, is On Mars from Vital Lacerda. Vital Lacerda had the idea that you were on Mars or you were in orbit around the station, and you had to basically tailor the actions you could do as well as what you had based on whether you were in orbit or on Mars. And occasionally you had to shuttle between the two, and certain actions could only be done on Mars and certain actions can only be done on here. This one doesn't have that restriction with the actions, although settling is entirely new world, but you can do it whenever you want to settle. That one had more of a placement positional aspect, where depending where you were really restricted what you could do and can't do. Here, you don't have that positional aspect. Instead, it's the resources that you're having to juggle between A and B. And that is, as we'll get onto, one of the more enjoyable aspects, but there's the difference between that and On Mars. On Mars restricted your actions, this one more restricts your resources. And this one is definitely a heavy game, but I would say a lot easier to comprehend than On Mars was. On Mars was a pretty complex Lacerda, even for a Lacerda game. This one is still heavy, but nowhere near as mind-boggling as that.
Isn't that lovely?
So as I briefly mentioned, this whole concept of balancing old versus new is the most fun part of this game. I like resource management games in general, but the idea that I've got to think, right, well, hang on a minute, I've got, and unfortunately it has to be cubes, but we'll go with cubes. Let's say I've got a bit of energy over here, got a bit of food over here, but it's like I need energy over here because I want to build a factory and I want to settle it there. Well, somehow I've got to get energy from here to here, or I need to do an action to get me energy on this planet, and then I can do stuff with it. This whole thing of like moving them between each worlds, particularly with, ships and having to think, right, well, the ship's now on the new world. I need to spend energy to fly it back, and then it can pick up stuff and do it. Oh, it's a big logistics puzzle, but it's a fun logistics puzzle. There's a bit of faff to it, we'll get onto that a bit later, but it's still the meat of this game, and it's still the most fun aspect of this game. The other aspect I enjoy is this idea of the power levels.
It's over 9,000!
Now, it's got no theme whatsoever. I mean, this game literally has no theme. We're kind of like, the theme is just gone, but the power level aspect of these actions and the action cards is something I quite like, because 2 aspects later, the bonus card and this track, do rely on you sort of thinking, right, well, I want to do these particular actions, but hang on, if I do this action, that's 4. That means I'm going to go too fast on this progress track, or I'm going to be too high for a particular bonus on those bonus cards. And so I like the fact that it's not just simply picking out what actions you want to do, but also trying to balance out the number values of them. Theme, what does it matter in this case? But as a mechanic, it's still quite interesting and still good fun. It's also just a neat puzzle to have, where it's kind of like an engine builder, that you start with an engine and then it goes in reverse, because you start with the engine that's already in place. You've got a good production system and you've got everything on the old world, but now you've got to get it over here. And so your engine over here dissipates as the engine in this one gets bigger. Very unique compared to a lot of other games. But that in itself represents a good game arc over the 4 rounds. You start off not being able to do a lot on the new world, but as you get further on, you'll be able to do much more there. And to start with, you're doing a decent amount on the old world, but then later on, you'll start not being able to do much on the old world. So it doesn't necessarily feel like you, in most engine builder games, where you start off and there's like, oh, there's not really much I can do in the first round. It's a pretty mediocre first round. No, you'll start off being able to do a few things, but in terms of how you're scoring points and doing well, you won't be able to do too much of that. But it doesn't feel like the first round is like, whatever, we're just going through the motions in the first round, let's just do a few basic actions and we're done. No, it's all still pretty important. You need to make the foundations of getting to the new world apparent in the first round. It's just that what you're focusing on changes as the game goes through. And let's say that is pretty cool and unique to a lot of engine builders. Not the longest good section, but there are reasons for that. Let's start off first with the components, aesthetics, and basically all that stuff. It's pretty much built to a budget, and this is not a cheap game. I mean, this was selling for a good like 60 odd euro at Essen, and I don't think you get 60 euro worth of stuff in this box, because yes, there's a decent amount of pieces, but it's all pretty bare bone pieces. I mean, you've got these little plastic strep saws to mark everything, thin little cardboard tiles. You've got pretty flimsy cards that already are marking. I mean, if you've got slightly sweaty fingers or if it's too hot or something, you'll actually start to notice these cards scuff in your hands. You know, you really do want to sleeve these. You're using cubes for resources, which is just boring, and you have to remember that the big ones are worth 3, not 5, like most games. It's built to a budget. And even the aesthetics themselves, it's not particularly great artwork. There's nothing in here that stands out as, oh, that looks really cool. The board is colourful, although if you are colourblind, you're screwed. And I mean royally screwed, because yes, some of the stuff like the factories have a little symbol on it to tell you what type of factory it is, but in terms of the circle notches, there is no way to distinguish from green to orange to black. If you're colorblind and you can't distinguish those 3 colors, you cannot physically play this game. It is physically impossible. And you would think that they would do something to make it a little bit more colorblind friendly, but nope, sorry colorblind people, you get to suffer yet again. The biggest hit with this aesthetically is not just how kind of bland it looks, apart from being a slightly colorful board, it's just how bad the graphic design is. Oh my word. There are so many instances where the graphic design and the rules are so faffy or so fiddly that you just wonder how they came up with it. You know, most stuff on this board is not clear as to what it does. It's like, you know, you see a little logo icon there and you're like, what does that do? How does that work? And you've got to look up a micro rule in it. We'll get onto the rules a bit later, but there's stuff in here graphic design wise that's just weird. I mean, you've got the infrastructure cards that have like orientation requirements, and it's not clear that it means like along the entire line, not next door to each other. So that's a little off-putting. You've got the fact that you can only build the same illustration once on these infrastructure cards, which is a rule easily forgotten. Would it have killed to just put a name on the card like workshop or factory, and then you know that you can't build 2 factories? I mean, it worked in 7 Wonders. Doing it by picture is just kind of weird. But then also all this New World stuff. So when you settle a population B down here, you have to pay a steel for each one. Does anything tell you that you do? Nope, nothing. I mean, you could argue that the fact that the notches are circled in black means it requires a steel. That is your golden rule for saying that this costs a steel, just to circle it in black, which is already on a board that's partially black already? That is not a good idea for graphic design. And there's just other little things like that where, you know, the graphic design is just more fiddly than it needs to be. Stuff is just not inherently clear. The turn order track here, well, not the turn order track, the round track, you've got food in that you require, and it's like normally you would expect the line to point at the round itself, but it's not. It points in between the 2 rounds, and you have to kind of remember that as you pass this you need this limit, and it's just not crystal clear. And there's other aspects from slightly bad wording in, you know, on tiles, you know, some dodgy wording in the rule book. There's just a lot of things here, you know, that don't make it easy for you to learn the game. Even things like ships, the carrying capacity is not entirely clear. You know, it's just, I don't know, there's just bits and bobs here that make the game more of a fact than it needs to be.
It's stupid! It's stupid!
And from there we get on to the rulebook, which is not the worst rulebook I have seen. You know, the rulebook is relatively well written, there's a lot of pictorial examples, and I can understand what's being written. The problem is that this game has a lot of micro rules in it. So you play the game and you think, all right, that's how this bit works. But you got to remember the exception to the rule, or this little rule that gets overlooked. Remember that you can't build the same illustration twice. Nothing tells you about this. You have to remember it. Remember that beads cost a steal on this planet. Nothing reminds you of this. You just have to remember it. You know, you don't get a good reference aid in this game. Seriously, would it have killed you to put a reference card in here? Nope, all you get is a tiny little card with point endgame scoring and the round sequence. That's it. I know what the friggin' round sequence is, okay? You know, and even then, fine, you can put that on the card. Maybe you could have put it on the friggin' board. That might have been good. You know, some of this empty space here, you can have made use of it. But no, nothing to tell me what the icons mean, apart from the back of the rulebook again. Nothing to remind me of the frequently overlooked rules. It's like, no. You know, it's got rules reminders on the back of the book. But again, I don't want it on the back of the rulebook as a globule of text. I want decent reference cards that are easy to reference. That's the whole point of the things. But there's just a lot of times where you realize that you've done a rule wrong because it's an exception to a rule, and it's just another little thing you've got to contend with. It's also pretty much a solitaire game. through and through. This game has pretty much no multiplayer interaction whatsoever. You know, the only interaction in this is you took my card, you took my ship, you took my site, which is the same indirect interaction we've seen in every game. It's like no different from Revive practically, and people defended Revive as being interactive somehow. But this one, I mean, if you thought Underwater Cities was not interactive, or like, you know, Pulsar and that, if you thought those games weren't interactive, oh my word, you're in for a shock with this one, because this is even less interactive than those. You are playing a solitaire puzzle that you are doing yourself. I cannot change what you do on your board, or the progress track, whatever. All I can do is possibly nick a site, but I don't know what sites you're gonna nick. I mean, there's loads of places you can go, and if you've gone past these transition points, you can go on more of this planet. I've got no way to block you on here specifically. I mean, if I do take something you want, it's entirely by fluke. You know, there's no like, oh, I know they're gonna do that, so maybe I'll try this, or adapt my strategy as a result. No, you honestly could not care less the other players are there. You could have literally got a robot to do what they do. And it's emphasized more in the solo mode. The solo mode is literally just play the multiplayer game through and through. There's like a tiny little like card I think you flip for the solo modes, and you know, yeah, there's a card you flip and it dictates what they do, but for the most part you're just doing what you do. Problem is, the solo mode is very punishing. I mean, you can evacuate everybody off your planet and still not score anywhere near enough for it to be considered a good score. It's a beat your own score type feel, and it's like, that's not fun. You've given me a really tight, really punishing solo mode, and you know, it doesn't make me want to play it in that regard, but then playing it solo is kind of the way you should play this game, because frankly, playing this with more players is entirely pointless. The theme aspect is just entirely lost as well. I mean, I get the idea that you're moving from one planet to the next, but then they throw in some mechanics that just don't make a lot of sense. I mean, the infrastructure cards are literally build in random patterns and then you get more production. Somehow. I mean, don't ask me how that works, okay? But the theme just goes off the rails in some respects. I mean, the whole power level of the cards thing, it's a fun mechanic, but what the hell does it even mean? And why do you have a bonus card here that says, oh, if you get 6 power, you get to have this bonus, but if you get 12 power, you get to have this one. It's like,
what the hell are you talking about?
It's insane. And it just goes even off the rails when you consider this thing, this slingshot track. You know, progress markers, 2 little satellites they're meant to be or something. But basically your power level determines how far you can choose to move these things. And when it gets to certain places, I can now build on these areas, because apparently I need my satellite to be in a certain place before I can build on sand rather than tundra.
Why is it still blurry?
That's all the resolution we have. Making it bigger doesn't make it clearer.
The theme's just all over the shop, and the fact that they've got these little settlement symbols, like I can't settle on this spot here, a random spot in the middle of the tundra area, because I don't have my satellites on the yellow symbol and the weird swirly black hole symbol. Why? It's like the theme is just the theme works against itself. I know I make fun of games that are dry and abstract, but man, this game tries hard to self-destruct its own theme here, and this is a game that should be dripping with theme. You could make a really good fun theme with this sort of evacuation theme of planets and settling and stuff. Instead, it just goes 100% fully mechanical, and it shouldn't have.
You cut me deep, Shrek. You cut me real deep just now.
The game also doesn't know what it wants to be. It's got too many variants and too many ways of playing. When Vladimir first made this game, it was designed with just the race variant. So the race variant was how it was meant to be done. The problem with the race variant is that it ends too abruptly at times, and that put off a lot of Eurogamers. And to be fair, I'm not the biggest fan of how it ends either. So okay, you've got the points mode. What about them? Well, the problem with the points mode is these goal cards. You draft from them at the start of the game, and most of them will be in the game, so you know which ones are in existence. But some of these are definitely easier to do than others, and also it represents a good 80% of your score in the game. I mean, if you think you're maybe scoring in the 60s for a typical score, a good 40, 50 of those points could be from just the goal cards. And these are hidden. So a lot of the scoring in this game is hidden scoring, which is not really good. You don't really get an idea of who's about to win. It can throw a little bit of a surprise at the end where somebody you thought was going to lose actually does put it back. But it means that if you don't do well on these goals, you will lose. Like, you cannot do badly on these goals and win the game. It's physically impossible. You won't get enough points from your production marker, the lowest one of the lot, and the stadium happiness thing is such a throwaway amount of points. I mean, you know, the most happy faces is good for turn order. Great. At the end of the game, you get 6, 4, or 1 points for having the first, second, third most happy faces. Whoopie-doo, it's such an arbitrary mechanic. So everything's all about these goals, but it's a lot easier to build a bunch of factories or to get your food production high in something than it is to get specific bonuses on the bonus card every round, or to do tons of infrastructure cards, or to get all your technologies leveled up. You know, there's certainly some that are a bit more easier to get a lot of points than others, and they're not equal. You can get more points on some of them than others, so you might be able to do well on one, but if it caps at 11 points and somebody can cap it at 17, well, they can get 6 more points than you. It's just, they needed to be a little bit more balanced and fair and just not be the emphasis of points mode. You know, there could have been other things we could have got points for in the game, but the game is pretty punishing in the sense that if you don't get stuff, if you don't meet the stadium requirements or the food requirements, which doesn't happen that often, but it can happen, you get penalty points, which are quite severe. I mean, we're talking -3, -2 for these penalty points, and bearing in mind you're only finishing in the 60s a lot of the time, that's a lot of points. But then if you don't evacuate stuff off the old planet, not only do you lose points for like the tiles you don't flip, but you also lose additional points if population beads don't get done. So your score can be crippled, even if you just leave 1 or 2 of these. Like, you know, one of them alone, a couple of population beads, is a good 4 or 5 penalty points. That's a lot of your score just because one tile couldn't get evacuated. I know the game's called Evacuation, but for crying out loud, you don't need to be quite so strict on that rule.
I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
Okay, a simple wrong would have done just fine, but...
You know, a little bit of penalty every now and again, but it does force your hand. And one problem with that is that the game plays very linear. It plays very samey for every game. There's no real depth of strategies in this. You basically must evacuate as much as you can off this planet because you will just get penalized too much. You must adhere to your goals, and most of them are kind of rinse repeats of each other. Build a bunch of factories, build a bunch of stuff here, or get a bunch of production from here. That's kind of it. So it's not like somebody plays this game and goes, ooh, I'm going to try this strategy. It's really funky and different. You know, it's not like playing Caverna where you can enjoy really, really different stuff. Here, it's the same thing. Everyone's doing the same thing, and I would have just liked a bit more variety and depth in that regard. The modules? Oh dear. You have public objectives as one, which, whatever. It's such a small variant, who cares? You put a bunch of public objectives out. If you meet the milestone, you get the card, and it can be more points and production. That's literally it. Doesn't do much else. And frankly, you could take or leave throwing it in, and it gears people to compete for those because they're worth a lot of points. I mean, 5 points, that's nearly 10% of your score. So it again makes the game more linear than it needs to be. Take it or leave it. But line majority module? Oh my god, I call it the Pac-Man module. If you thought the theme was already destroyed on this game with this whole new world thing, this module is ridiculous. You put these little Pac-Man markers in 3 specific spots around this thing, and you get points at the end of the game if you can build all your stuff in a particular line across where they intersect. What is the thematic reason for that being a thing?
Stupid! It's stupid!
I don't get why it's even in the game. This had to have been just something that Vladimir thought off on the fly, had in his sock drawer for a while, and then suddenly bolted onto this game as a module. Who was crying out for something like that? It's just so stupid. But it's a small module, whatever. So what about the advanced action card variant and the generous variant? Well, the generous variant is mandatory. I'm not playing this game without the generous variant. The bonus cards you've got, I'll see if I can find one. If I can't find one, I won't bother, but I can't find one off the top of my head. But basically, I'll put a picture up. The bonus cards basically have 2 different things that you can aim for, but in the proper rules, you have to get exactly the same power level for each one in order to get the bonus. That is too much. I'm sorry, you're already trying to contemplate old to new and deal with all your actions, all that lot, and you expect me to calculate exactly how much power I'm going to spend on all my actions on my turn, on the round, so I can get a little bonus later on. No. Play the generous variant where you have to get equal to or lower. I will use that every time. I will not play this game otherwise, because that is just a stupid restriction. There's no thematic reason for it, and it makes the game more tight and restrictive than it doesn't need to be. Use that variant. But then we come on to the action cards, and at first, I really enjoyed these. I mean, I really, in my first game, thought, I am not playing this game without these action cards, because basically you now have a hand of 4, and they've got different power levels on them, and they've got combinations of the actions that you have on your board, and so you can either do a board action, or you can do the cards. And at first, I thought this was brilliant. It's like, oh, it gives me so many options, gives me different ways to do my game, and it's like, great. And in the first game, I thought, brilliant, love this, never want to play this again. Then I played more games and then realized, uh-oh, there's a big problem with these cards, because the power levels on these are random. They're also not balanced. Some of these action cards are far better than others, and there are examples where literally the same action is on the card, except slightly worse than another action which is pretty much identical, other than the fact that maybe the power level is one different. And in some cases there are even cards that are literally identical on power level, except one card is objectively worse than the other. So these aren't entirely balanced, but the other problem is that they represent a big luck of the draw factor. I've had games where players have basically never been able to go across this progress track, which is kind of essential for you to do, because all they keep drawing is 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 2, you know, these power level cards. But there's ones that go up to 6 in here, and there's, you know, ones where you can pick your own and stuff, you know, 3 and 4 and 4. If you're lucky enough to pick those, then you can go far along the progress track. And yes, I know you can take your player board and do those actions, but those actions aren't as good as some of the cards. So somebody can just get away with the game because the cards they draw are better than others. And it does hurt in the early game if you don't progress along this track far enough. You know, you don't want to be held back for ages. You need to maintain a steady pace. So when I played with these action cards more, it came to me that I think that these are too swingy and too lucky, and there are players I've played with who actively will not play this game using the action cards. I mean, it's more faff to teach people, so it already makes the game more complicated, but yeah, you have more agency over your game if you use the player board actions only. So now, I don't want to use this variant. Evacuation is therefore a bit of a misfire. It doesn't have a proper identity to know what it means, and I'm seeing some people go mad for this, like 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10s, like they're loving this game, and I just can't understand how you can forgive certain aspects of this. You can't forgive the graphic design, the poor choices here. You can't forgive how some of these modules are far too swingy and kind of break the game in some respect. You know, you can't forgive some problems that this game has, you know, and suddenly give it 9, 10 out of 10s. I just don't get it. For me, the game does have some enjoyable aspects. I do love this whole transporting from old to new. I think the resource management part of it is really good fun. And I like that it's a meaty game that makes you have to sort of think hard about the actions you do. And the power level thing, as much as I mock its lack of theme, is still fun to try and think, well, hang on, how far do I want to move across this track? So which actions should I prioritize? There is good stuff here. But there's a lot of stuff that gets in the way and irks a lot of players. You know, the modules don't all work, particularly these action cards. The goals in points mode are too fundamental for you being able to do well, and they're not entirely balanced themselves. The whole stadiums and happy faces is such an arbitrary mechanic, it might as well not even be in the game. It's just there to introduce more restrictiveness. You know, the infrastructure cards. I mean, there's so few of them, and yet you've got this rule about not building the same illustration, as if anybody cares. It's, you know, there's a lot of these little micro rules that just get forgotten. And it's not like, you know, the rules are not the most complex in the world, but it just, with no reference aids and no easy way to kind of like, hang on, how does that rule work with this? You know, you're gonna get into some FAQ moments from time to time. It's these individual problems don't break the game to make it unplayable or necessarily a bad game, but they are significant flaws. And, you know, as much as some of that good stuff is powerful good stuff, you know I didn't mention a ton in the good section, but they are really solid aspects. I can't forgive the problems this game has. This is not up to par with a lot of the Vladimir stuff, and as much as I find games like, you know, I didn't get on with Woodcraft, and Messina and Praga are kind of bare bones, they're dry as well, I would still probably prefer to play those than this one, and I can't, as a critic, forgive some of the problems this has. I'm giving it overall a 5 out of 10. It's average. There's stuff I enjoy, and from time to time I might be convinced to play this, but again, you would have to cherry pick which variants to do, which mode you do, and I shouldn't have to do that with a game. It should be designed properly for a particular way from the get-go. It's why I don't like games that throw in a competitive and a co-op mode. Those rarely work. This is the same. Don't put multiple modes in your game. Put a couple of variants, but give me a robust system. And if you want to introduce new modes to the game, do it in an expansion. Let expansions handle new modes. Don't make your base game that, because it just means that you don't know what you want it to be and you try to please everybody, and at the end you don't please anybody. Although I'm pretty sure this game does have its fans. I have seen some reviewers go goo goo gaga for this, and I don't get it. I honestly don't. It's, it's got some good aspects and I do enjoy parts of this, but I think this one just feels a bit rushed, in production, in design, and 5 is still an average game. It doesn't make it bad, but if it didn't have some of those good aspects, it would easily be a 4, and I did contemplate a 4, but I thought, is this worse than Stonemaier's Expeditions games? Probably not. But I was kind of expecting a lot more from this combination, and I really wanted something that compared to something like Underwater Cities and Pulsar 2849, and I just don't think that this is going to get a huge amount of talk in several years, and it's certainly not one that I'm going to be desperate to play for a while. So that's it for me on this episode of The Broken Meeple. If you like what you see, then please thumb it up on YouTube and thumb it up on Board Game Geek when it goes live on the page. Follow the link in the description, get your thumbs there and let it stand out in the hot review section. And don't forget to leave your comments down below as to what you think of the game and Vladimir Sushi's other designs, and obviously Delicious Games' other designs. I'm sure some of you fans are going to be like, what the hell are you talking about? 5 out of 10, but hey, I'd certainly like you to be able to justify some of these bad points as to why it makes a 10 out of 10. But, if you love the game, go for it. There's other designs that I like from Vladimir Suhi. This just didn't make up to par. But, of course, check out the rest of the content I've been doing. All these Essen reviews are piling out like crazy. Plenty of stuff for you to watch. So take care, and remember, regardless if you want to stay on the old world and die a horrible death, or settle on my new planet with space cricket and happy faces, it's still only a game. Bye for now.